The sun hadn't yet risen when armored vehicles rolled past the gates of Ouagadougou's presidential compound, bearing foreign insignias. By the time President Ibrahim Traoré finished his morning prayer, his Minister of Defense whispered one chilling sentence into his ear: "Sir, they're here for you." What followed wasn't just a breach of sovereignty, it was a betrayal from supposed allies. But when the cameras finally turned on, it wasn't Traoré who was handcuffed. The world watched live as the unthinkable happened. How did a man they came to arrest end up standing taller than them all? Find out on Courageous Voices, because this story will shock you to your core. The streets of Ouagadougou were still cloaked in sleep when the Nigerian convoy rolled through the city's southern checkpoint. It looked ordinary enough: two diplomatic black SUVs bearing official plates, followed by a third, unmarked and silent. Inside that third vehicle, Colonel Edwin Okoro, head of Nigeria's covert Omega unit, scrolled through the final version of the mission dossier. It was stamped with a crimson seal: Operation Silence, Eyes Only. The official story was simple: border security talks, counterinsurgency cooperation, and a renewed bilateral trade agenda. But deep within the sealed envelope handed to Okoro before leaving Abuja was something far more dangerous: a classified order authorizing the extraction of President Ibrahim Traoré, dead or alive, should he resist. No international court, no official record, just a cleanup plan drafted in the shadows by powerful men terrified of a young leader who was inspiring a continent. At the Nigerian embassy in Ouagadougou, Ambassador Ngoy Mamano rehearsed her lines in front of a mirror, voice steady, hands trembling. She had been told the speech was symbolic, a distraction while the operation played out behind closed doors. But what they hadn't counted on, what no document in Abuja dared admit, was Traoré's network: veterans of the Sahel Wars, loyalists from Sankara's forgotten battalions, young hackers with one foot in the military, the other in cyberspace. By the time the sun broke over the city, the trap had been set, but not for Traoré, for those who thought sovereignty could be kidnapped before breakfast. They didn't fear his weapons, they feared his words. Curious yet? Stay with Courageous Voices, because the real twist is just beginning. In less than a year, Ibrahim Traoré had done what no one in West Africa had dared. He stared down French military commanders, tore up long-standing foreign agreements, and sent soldiers in patched uniforms to reclaim airstrips once guarded by NATO-trained forces. His speeches, broadcast from modest podiums, ignited sparks in Mali, Niger, and Guinea, sparks that began to burn old loyalties, replacing them with something far more dangerous: hope. In Nigeria, President Tinubu's cabinet met behind sealed doors. The reports were unsettling. Students at Ahmadu Bello University were quoting Traoré in debate clubs. Soldiers in Borno whispered about a Sahel alliance that would answer only to African soil. It was Charles Bakar, the hardline Minister of Internal Affairs, who finally said what no one else dared: if we wait, he becomes a symbol; if we act now, we can still call it prevention. Bakar and Ambassador Ngoy Mamano had built their careers silencing insurgencies in Nigeria's north. Both had overseen brutal crackdowns disguised as peacekeeping operations. They saw in Traoré not a diplomat, but a wildfire moving eastward. To them, Burkina Faso's transitional leader wasn't just young, he was uncontrollable, untied to Western aid, immune to bribes, revered by soldiers and civilians alike. Worse, he wasn't asking for a seat at the table, he was flipping the table. So, when intelligence reports claimed he planned to meet with Tuareg commanders from northern Mali, it triggered a signal. Mamano made the call: deploy Omega, no leaks, no second chances. Because if Traoré succeeded in uniting the Sahel,
It wouldn't just destabilize Nigeria's influence, it would redefine who held the pen when Africa's next chapter was written.
The marble floors of the Kosiam Palace gleamed under the morning light, cameras clicking as journalists packed the briefing hall.
Flags of Burkina Faso and Nigeria flanked the podium where President Ibrahim Traoré was scheduled to speak alongside Ambassador Ngoy Mimano.
It was meant to be symbolic, two nations discussing unity, trade, and the fight against insurgency.
But symbols, like silence, can be weaponized.
Midway through the introductions, a suited man in the Nigerian delegation leaned toward one of Traoré's aides and whispered, "His Excellency is requested in the West Wing for a confidential discussion." The phrasing was polite, the timing was not. Traoré narrowed his eyes, nodded slowly, and handed his notes to his chief of staff. "I'll be back in 5." As he disappeared down the side corridor, his security detail noticed something strange. 3 new faces, not previously logged with the diplomatic list, loitered near the hall's side exits. One wore a communications earpiece not standard for press handlers, another adjusted a coat heavy enough to hide restraints. It wasn't raining. Outside, the usual convoy of diplomatic sedans had been swapped. Black SUVs, military-grade, armored, idled near the exit, their windows tinted pitch dark.
A drone buzzed faintly overhead, its camera pointed not at the palace roof, but the rear courtyard.
Inside the West Wing, Traoré entered a room with no interpreters, no notebooks, no official photographer, just 4 men in suits, and one steel briefcase resting on the table.
Mimano stood by the window, silent.
Then came the sound, barely a click, from a belt holster behind him, not loud, but unmistakable, the sound of cuffs being readied not for peace, but power. That was the moment Traoré knew this wasn't diplomacy, it was an ambush dressed in protocol. The hall outside the West Wing held its breath. The press conference continued, but the energy shifted. Aides glanced at their watches, security shifted uneasily near the walls. Something was wrong. In the operations room beneath the palace, Colonel Sato Zita, Traoré's intelligence chief, listened intently as a scrambled transmission came through a redirected satellite feed. A sharp voice, unmistakably Nigerian, clipped through the static. "Extract the target within the hour, no media, ensure full diplomatic cover."
Zita froze. He replayed it once, twice. The code matched a previously flagged Nigerian directive, Operation Silence. He looked up at his team. "They're not here for talks." On the 3rd floor, Traoré stood calmly in the center of the West Wing conference room. The briefcase on the table had not been opened, and no documents were passed, just staring, silent pressure, subtle intimidation. "I'll step out for a moment," Traoré said, nodding politely. "Too much coffee." He left the room without a guard. He didn't need one. As he walked down the hallway, a palace staffer passed by and handed him a single slip of paper. It read, "Zita has eyes, tunnel clear." No hesitation, he moved swiftly down a restricted hallway through a storage room and pressed a panel behind a rusting bookshelf. The wall clicked open with the quiet dignity of history. Decades earlier, Thomas Sankara had commissioned escape tunnels beneath the palace just in case. As the door closed behind him, the air grew cooler, the hum of chaos faded above. Back in the West Wing, the Nigerian agents shifted impatiently. One checked his watch, another gripped the cuffs. But when they turned to collect their target, the chair was empty, so was the corridor. Traoré was gone, and now they were the ones exposed.
By midday, the sun blazed over Ouagadougou, but the streets had already caught fire in another way. Word spread fast, first through encrypted messages, then in shouted whispers at market stalls and bus stops. They tried to take him. They came for Traoré, 4 men in suits, cuffs in their hands. By 12:17 p.m., the first wave of students had reached the Place de la Révolution, carrying handwritten signs and beating empty jerry cans like war drums. The chant rose like smoke. Taxi drivers abandoned their fares to block major roads with their vehicles, vendors shut their stalls and joined the tide. Inside the presidential palace, the Nigerian delegation's smiles had long since faded. Ambassador Mamano stood near a window, staring at the crowd that now packed the gates. Colonel Okoro barked into his satellite phone, but no response came back. The extraction team had failed. Their target had vanished, and now they were prisoners inside a building meant to host them. Loyalist soldiers previously guarding the exterior had reoriented, subtle but intentional, shoulders squared, fingers resting closer to triggers. Every Nigerian movement was shadowed. The unspoken message, "We see you now." From the rooftops, young Burkinabe waved flags bearing Traoré's face, their voices a wall of fury and devotion. Drones buzzed overhead, not for surveillance, but to live stream the unfolding chaos to a continent hungry for defiance. In the control room, Colonel Zita turned to a junior officer and said flatly, "No need to arrest them, let the people hold court today." And as the chants echoed through the capital, one phrase rose above the rest, louder, sharper, unstoppable: Ouagadougou Abuja. Ouagadougou is not Abuja, this land does not kneel. At 2:06 p.m., every television and radio frequency across Burkina Faso interrupted its programming. The screen faded to black, then returned with a single steady image. President Ibrahim Traoré, seated at a long oak table, flanked on one side by uniformed commanders from Mali and Guinea, and on the other by student activists, farmers, and elders. A national flag hung behind him, not draped in grief, but upright in resolve. His voice was measured, calm, not angry, not theatrical, just undeniable. Today, a breach of sovereignty was attempted on Burkinabe soil. I am alive, not because I fled, but because our ancestors taught us where the real power lies, with the people. He held up a red folder, the seal of the Nigerian embassy still clinging to the front. "This document," he said, "authorizes a covert mission by a unit referred to as Omega. It speaks of extraction, of neutralization. It names me a destabilizing force in the region, and it was signed not by the Nigerian people, but by those afraid of African independence." He slid the document across the table for the cameras to see. Names, code words, timelines. One of the activists beside him leaned forward. "We are not destabilizing Africa, we are reclaiming it." The cameras kept rolling, no filters, no cuts, no press officers whispering what to say, just the truth, loud enough to echo past borders. Traoré looked straight into the lens, to the young man in Kano, the woman in Accra, the soldier in Bamako. "This isn't just about me, this is about you. If they can come for one voice, they can come for all, but not if we rise before they arrive." Then he smiled, not out of victory, but defiance, and the screen faded to black once more. By nightfall, the world was watching. Al Jazeera replayed the footage of Traoré's televised address on loop. BBC analysts scrambled to decode the red folder's contents. CNN aired side-by-side footage of Nigerian officials entering the palace and never leaving. Across Africa, the phrase Operation Silence trended above celebrity scandals and football scores. In Abuja, the silence inside Aso Rock was louder than any speech. President Tinubu cancelled public appearances. State broadcasters tried to spin the story as miscommunication, but the streets didn't buy it. At the University of Lagos, thousands gathered on campus grounds holding candles and placards. "Africa is awake." In Kaduna, protesters spray-painted walls with one haunting question: if Traoré was a threat, why fear his words more than his weapons? Then the dam broke. A mid-level Senate staffer named Ibrahim Dogo leaked internal correspondence showing that Operation Silence had been greenlit by a backdoor committee chaired by Minister Charles Bakar. The justification: to prevent destabilizing ideologies from contaminating West African unity. But what stood out wasn't the words, it was the signature chain: rogue security advisors, unsanctioned funding, no presidential stamp. The leak lit a firestorm inside Nigeria's parliament. Opposition leaders demanded Bakar's resignation, civil society groups called for an independent investigation, foreign embassies began pulling their staff from joint defense offices. Meanwhile, ECOWAS leaders issued vague statements of deep concern, but behind closed doors, their tone shifted. Guinea and Mali condemned the attempted arrest outright. Senegal's foreign minister described it as a dangerous return to colonial playbooks, except this time written in African ink. And back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't gloat. He met with youth leaders, spoke quietly with generals, and walked home under the stars. He knew this wasn't victory, this was only the exposing of a wound, and now the healing where the war would begin. The air outside the Nigerian embassy in Ouagadougou was thick with silence, the kind that comes before something irreversible. Reporters from across the continent stood shoulder to shoulder. The embassy gates, usually closed and guarded, were wide open. Cameras were already live, no podium, no flag, just the concrete steps and a microphone trembling in the breeze. Ambassador Ngoy Mamano emerged slowly, her face pale, her posture rigid but brittle. She had spent the night in frantic communication with Abuja, demanding guidance, begging for a way out, but there was no cover left to hide under. The African Union had issued a public statement condemning the unauthorized foreign operation. France distanced itself. The U.S. requested a formal inquiry. There was no fixing it now, only surrendering to the fallout. She unfolded a single page, her hands trembled slightly as the camera zoomed in. On behalf of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, she began, voice unsteady, we extend our sincere and unreserved apology to the people and government of Burkina Faso. The words weren't hers, they were drafted by Traoré's legal aides, reviewed by his Council of Elders, and approved only after two key Nigerian officials agreed to resign. We deeply regret our actions, she continued, and acknowledge the breach of protocol and trust committed by rogue elements within our delegation. Her voice cracked, she paused, then, in a moment that sent shockwaves across Africa, she bowed low, slow. As the shutters clicked and live streams lit up with disbelief, that single act rewrote the power dynamic in real time. It was no longer about one young president, it was about something larger, the restoration of dignity in a continent too long manipulated by silence. Traoré didn't appear, he didn't need to, he had already won without lifting a hand. The halls of Kosiam Palace were quiet again, but it was not the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of consequence. The press had packed up their gear, the protesters had gone home, their chants now echoing on phones across the continent. And President Ibrahim Traoré, standing in the rose garden near the central fountain, took a deep breath before speaking to the small cluster of journalists waiting for him. We will not pursue legal charges, he said plainly. Africa must heal, not fracture. The statement was received with stunned silence, then scattered applause. Some called it restraint, others called it wisdom, but none could deny the weight of it. Traoré knew that justice in the traditional sense could only go so far, and sometimes what a nation needed more than vengeance was vision. That evening, he hosted a press dinner, local dishes, soft music, relaxed laughter. To the world, it looked like a leader moving forward. But beyond the candlelit tables and smiling diplomats, a far more serious meeting was unfolding behind closed doors. In a secure wing of the palace, Traoré sat with intelligence chiefs from Mali, Chad, and Guinea. No translators, no recordings, just direct questions and hard truths. They won't stop here, said the Chadian general, voice low. If one plan failed, another will follow. This was not just Nigeria, this was a test.
Traoré nodded, unmoved. Then we passed the next one, too.
Maps were unfolded, routes were traced, names mentioned, quiet alliances began to form, not with signatures, but with understanding, because what had just happened in Ouagadougou was not an isolated event, it was a signal, and while the world moved on, those in the room knew the next storm had already begun gathering. The headlines came quietly, buried beneath news of infrastructure projects and trade reforms. In Nigeria, President Tinubu announced a cabinet reshuffle. Minister Charles Bakare resigned for health reasons, several intelligence officials retired early. Ambassador Ngoy Mamano was reassigned to a consulate in Eastern Europe. No official link was drawn to the events in Ouagadougou, but everyone understood the silence was its own confession. In Burkina Faso, life resumed with a strange stillness. Markets reopened, roads were cleared, and the chants had faded from the plazas, but in the Kosiam Palace, the memory lingered, not as trauma, but as clarity. One morning, just past dawn, Ibrahim Traoré walked alone through the Garden of Union, where trees from every African nation had been planted after the coup that brought him to power. Some were still saplings, others older than the palace itself. He paused beside a young baobab from Zimbabwe, ran a hand across its bark, and turned slightly as his defense chief approached. "They'll try again," the man said. Traoré nodded, eyes on the horizon. "History is quiet," he whispered, "until it screams." No press conference followed, no decree, no retaliation, and yet, across Africa, in boardrooms and barracks, embassies, and lecture halls, a question echoed louder than ever: what happens when a young leader refuses to bow even as the world conspires to break him? The answer wasn't in a document or broadcast, it was in the restraint, the resolve, the refusal to fall into the trap of bitterness, because Traoré didn't win by shouting, he won by enduring, and now a continent watched, holding its breath, not for the next move, but for the next young voice willing to rise and say, "Not this time, not this land, not this future." If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Courageous Voices for more powerful, true, inspired African stories that mainstream media won't show you. Drop a comment below. Do you think Traoré did the right thing by showing restraint? Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode, because the battle for Africa's dignity is just getting started. Share this video with someone who still believes in real leadership. Let's amplify the truth together on Courageous Voices.